Poets House is a non-profit poetry library and literary center that is free and open to the public. We have one of the most comprehensive independent poetry collections available on open shelves. Our library includes over 100,000 volumes of poetry, and we host readings, workshops, and youth programs. Tonight, poet and translator Ricardo Alberto Maldonado will give a talk on the Peruvian poet César Vallejo, followed by a Q&A. Our Password series invites poets to speak about another poet who has influenced their work. Our upcoming Password events include Wendy Su on Frank Lima on April 15, Jawid Mohadedi on Rumi's Masnavi on May 6, and Jake Skeets on Joy Harjo on May 20. Tonight's event and the entire Password series was made possible thanks to the generous support of Battery Park City Authority. Returning to César Vallejo in these times has felt especially urgent to me because I believe he is a poet who understood language as a liberating force. His poetry is incredibly playful. Within it, words become alive and unpredictable. In a world shaped by rigid, often totalizing discourses and by a kind of uniform experience dictated by the global north that flattens style, language, and even poetry into expectations of what a poem should do, we can follow Vallejo's impulses. We can give ourselves permission to play with language with the same sense of wonder as a child who finds a pebble on the ground. Vallejo's poetry is messy like life itself, flooded with emotion and embodied on the page through syntax and grammar that defy traditional Spanish conventions. In a similar way, I feel deeply moved by Ricky's work as a Latin American writer and poetry advocate, thinking and creating bilingually. I believe strongly in the ecosystem of poetry, that when we are exposed to different sensibilities, our perception and understanding of the world expands. So thank you, Ricky, for all your hard work and for being here with us tonight. But before formally introducing Ricardo, I'd like to invite all of you to a couple of upcoming events here at Poets House. On Tuesday, April 14 at 7 p.m., we're hosting a reading with Chase Bergeron, Lauren Camp, Megan Pinto, and Diaz Waldman. On Saturday, 18, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary. Yay! With a very special reading. And in fact, Ricky will be one of our readers. So please RSVP on our webpage and join us from 12 to 6 to hear poetry, eat cake, and enjoy live music. On Thursday, April 23rd, we're hosting a reading from new chapbook authors, including Katia Borgov, David Emke, Asha Futterman, Jed Munson, and Riley Radcliffe. And now, without anything further, I'll formally introduce Ricardo Alberto Maldonado. Ricardo Alberto Maldonado was born and raised in Puerto Rico. He is the author of The Life Assignment, 4-Way Books 2020, a finalist for the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award, one of Remezcla's best books by Latin or Latin American authors, and silver medalist for the Juan Felipe Herrera Best Poetry Book Award. He's also the translator of Dinapiera di Donato's Collaterales, Collateral, National Poetry Series, Akashic Books 2013, and co-editor of Puerto Rico en Mi Corazón, Anomalous Press 2019, a bilingual anthology that raised funds for grassroots recovery efforts in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Ricardo is a former president and executive director of the Academy of American Poets. Previously, he served as the co-director of 92nd Street Weiss Unterberg Poetry Center in New York City. He is the recipient of fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, Canto Mundo, Queer Art Mentorship, and the T.S. Eliot and Hawthornden Foundations. Please give a very warm welcome to Ricardo Alberto Maldonado.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I hope there is cake, ice cream cake, I mean, at the celebration. Happy National Poetry Month, or rather, month of the nation that poetry could be. Good evening. I feel César Vallejo deep within me. With the evening and when we leave, when the night falls. As I shared in promotion for my lecture in Vallejo's poetry, you pull, reader, you pull here, you pull there, and the whole corpus comes with. Every poem swims in the pool of a poem, and there's flesh, and there's tissue and morsels everywhere. And the boning one single Vallejo in the rainwater of the poem is unimaginable. Vallejo, in the growing conspiracy that is our reading, we find him in totality. As all of us who are legion to him will claim, we read him with a heart full, both faithful and true, or to rephrase his poem, God, we come to consecrate you, César, because you love so deeply, because you never smile, because of how your heart must always hurt you. In any case, sometime after 3 months of imprisonment and 8-hour passage from Trujillo to Lima, with legal proceedings still pending, the great Peruvian poet César Vallejo sailed from Peru to Europe in June 1923. To reference Los Heraldos Negros, Peru in winter, in Lima it rains, muddy water pouring from pain, down pours the rain upon this path of mine, this coffin where I've mired my bones down for you. That is my translation. Not long ago, after that, Vallejo's second collection, Trilce, appeared off the presses of the typographic workshop in the Lima Penitentiary in October 1922. Let's pause there. 1922, Annus Mirabilis, that convenient myth for postbellum literary production giving shape to decades of making it new. The publication of Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's The Wasteland, Rilke's Do We Know Elegies, Woolf's Jacob's Room, Mackay's Harlem Shadows, among notable exercises in content and in style. That apex in heaps of broken images and a crueler world war and the ensuing pandemic in the cultural imagination, of course, for any casual critic and reader, it had to be made new. Men must not cut down trees, as Woolf wrote. Changes the world enough to note it on the back of envelopes. And that was the ethos of it. It had to be made new regardless of cost, human and environmental. We were progressing. Who would be César Vallejo in the frothing imaginary of an early century method, if not an inolvidable cholo, as he named himself in a later poem to a friend? We'll get to it in a moment. If not César from the global south, sitting out on the bench of his house, missing the world out of Miguel, his long dead brother, while a shadow is lengthening over his soul? What would we say about Trilce and the full corpus of Vallejo's writing, if not that they are maddeningly complex masterpieces of profound astonishment and sadness, defiant humor and mystery and profound humanism? Some blows in life, they are so heavy, I don't know, blows as if dealt by God's own wrath. These blows came from the Andean land, not from the heavens. And we got, as Neruda would have it, that creasing poetry demanding with its wildling touch, but it is grandiose in superhuman ways, end quote. A poem may be a black stone lying over one white stone. So let's surface that again. Vallejo, that unforgettable cholo, had reclaimed that racial category of the mestizo in the imaginary of the Spanish Empire. And the word rooted itself as a project in the future. As Vallejo wrote in 1927, we must not forget that throughout the Hispano-Americanizing of our thoughts, there still pulses, still lives, still runs in an intermittent yet indestructible way the flow of indigenous blood as the dominant sign of our future. Our future. In art, the weight of tradition of dominant literature may be so strong that a colonial author may not detach himself from a European project. But there exists, as we will find out, a cultural tradition into which César Vallejo will be thrown at, between the metropolis and the highlands, between Spanish and Quechua. Vallejo lived with a myth for his land, viewing the present in light of the past, collapsing today and yesterday, tomorrow, into a present immemorial. So how should we read him? In 1927, he writes, "The political sensibility of the artist arises preferably and in its fullest authenticity by creating disquieting and nebulous politics that are broader than any catechism or collection of expressed ideas and are therefore limited to any particular moment, and purer than any questionnaire of concerns or ideals tied to a nationalist or universalist politics." In the course of his life, Vallejo would resist every affiliation with the glorious years of Latin American and European avant-garde. His poems even predate the coming of automatic writing in the West and the Surrealist Manifesto of 1924. And so in him we have a nebulous politic, where a charged, disquieting mist appears in the poem with its own internal politic. It troubles the poem, and it troubles craft, bringing in a complex and unsettling experience of Babel, and the dust and the particles of spittle. And in the vastness of obscurity is the star nursery, more than a doctrine for the heavens. In his vocabulary of Santiago de Chuco, and Lima, and Trujillo, in Paris, and in Moscow, Vallejo plays up a vocabulary that is strange, uncanny, nebulous, and also familiar. And his words, or rather, and if his words, his no nada, that is a know nothing, and if his trilce still won't exist on Merriam-Webster.com or the Urban Dictionary, we need to talk to the manager ASAP. In the course of probably 45 minutes, we will close read a selection of Vallejo's poems from Black Herald's 1918, Trilce 1922, and his posthumously published omnibus of prose poems, human poems, and Spain Take This Cup Away From Me. The last title needs a quick clarification. As Clayton Eshelman, his translator, argues, Vallejo may have considered presenting his final 3 books as 3 separate books: Payroll of Bones, Sermon on Barbarism, and Spain Take This Cup From Me. At any rate, throughout the lecture, I will be projecting slides on your screen, as you see. As I tell my students at Queens College, my practice of interpretation is indebted to Helen Wendler's poems, Poets, and Prose, an introduction, and an anthology and her model for how we could read a poem for its parts and how these fit together. When reading, often I am reminded of her sense of an antecedent scenario that would be somewhere in there, number 2. What has been happening before a poem begins? What has provoked the speaker into utterance? A reading of language and tone. What are the contexts of diction, chains of significant relationship? This close to this leads to that. Parts of speech that are emphasized. We can hear how the changes in tone we can hear in a speaker's voice as a poem goes along. And let's not forget the requirements of the imagination. What has a poem invented that is new, striking, memorable? in the context of genre, anthologies, rhythm, or in the speaker. Rather than prescriptive, I find her questions generative as mode for analysis and the creation of poems. And through them, we may discover that the vast corpus of Vallejo's writing is not illegible at all, but rather that he is parsable and in turn deeply our own. As we approach the heart of this lecture, I want to spend some time with a transitional poem we don't associate with the book Trilce, whose excerpt I now project on screen. So let's sail back for context to 1923. Vallejo is in flight towards Europe, rather sailing, fearful of imprisonment, never to return back to Peru, even though he was invited to return. When that same year, a poem titled Trilce, written in Paris after the collection had been finished under the same name, is published in a magazine, Alfar. It was, in fact, the first poem Vallejo published on European soil. He never intended this poem to belong to the book, yet in his mind, the title persisted, a kind of residual chatter gluing itself beyond the margins of the book. The name itself had come out of financial pressure and sound. The printer's bill for resetting the pages would cost 3 additional libras. The original title was Bronze Skulls. And so Vallejo turned the number 3 over in his mouth until it deformed. Tres, 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 tries, trils, finally arriving at Trilce, kill your darlings. In the end, the published collection would not bear the poem Trilce. Who's making all that racket and not even leaving? That's how the collection begins. And so with that, Vallejo breathes into the nostrils and the poem becomes a living thing with living words. We get, well, the racket of tres and trilce, you understand. Trilce. There is a place that I myself know in this world, no less we will ever reach, where even if our foot were to reach it for an instant, it will be truly as if we are not there. Is that spot which is seen every moment in this life, walking in a single row, the side of myself and of my pair of yokes, I have glimpsed it, always distant from destinies. Now you can depart on foot out of sheer sentiment bareback, since not even stamps could reach it. The T-collar horizon is dying to colonize it for its great whatever part. But the place that I myself know, in this world no less, sought pace with its opposites. Close that door that is ajar in the entrails of that mirror. This one, no, its sister. It cannot be closed. It is not possible to ever reach that spot where the bolts act up unbound. Such is the place that I myself know. So let's take a look at the 1st and 7th stanza. He begins, hay un lugar que yo me sé, en este mundo nada menos. You see that there, a donde nunca llegaremos. And then the translation, there is a place that I myself know, in this world no less we will never reach. Do you notice any oddities about agency or speech acts? What could trouble the poem into being? There is, starts with the impersonal form of haber. There being there is in the thick of it. Of course, there must be something there. There is a place. We come to a place that is common, a concrete noun, but of non-specific referential property, whose place is this where one could hear a racket, maybe, for example. I myself know this unfolds in the realm of the dative. We add personal involvement, no me sé, no sé. And I myself, the verb, takes on reflections of that self. I know that place myself, even in the vagueness of place. What is the line asking us to read at the moment of breaking? Might this be a moment of hesitation, or would hesitation invite a revision of assumptions, a clarification, or even an extension of the puzzle? What constitutes the essence of this experience? We move to in this world no less, and we get a prepositional phrase with a demonstrative modifier, an idiomatic expression with a rhetorical force. Force world, this world is concrete, and it is insistent of all the places. This one is not trivial nor unexpected. We will never reach it. I am spelling out the poem as an incantation. The future has nuance, as it is not just we won't arrive or we will never be able to arrive, and so the world becomes impossible and inevitable and final. Consider how Vallejo, in the sources of insecurity and security, you have a place, not the place, versus I know. Consider that identity expanding. I myself leads to a we. Consider the areas of negation and reversal. Nada, nothing, nunca, never, reversos, opposites. These stanzas of the poem Trilce, as a unit, are a place for self-reference, rather than merely the descriptions of a place. When we read a poem, we are the voice in the poem. We stand with the words and speak them as if they were our own. To read a poem, to be in the this of our world that a poem bears, is an auditory cognitive process where the brain translates the visual into sound patterns. We all know this. To hear a poem is an illusion that we live with, that we arrange ourselves by, with our own motions in the air and the freedom of our mind. To put it another way, when we read Trilce, we read a Vallejo who is measured and personal. He is declarative and of authority. He is utterly confident in what he seeks to communicate and how we may interpret it. And yet he is reflective and resigned and introspective and melancholic and paradoxical. In this world, in that place we know, we are always seeking out. And so by the transitive property, we also want to say something, however obscure the language might seem in print or even in babble. We too are that babble from that guy who does not suffer pain as César Vallejo, as he writes, who does not ache in himself as an artist and as a man or as a simple living being. This César Vallejo also suffers from further within. He suffers today and yesterday from a very deep place. And he suffers only, and he suffers in solitude. Even when he comes to speak about hope, he suffers. All of which to say, about suffering, he was never wrong. César Vallejo. How well he understood its human position, how it takes place while he may have been eating or opening a window, or just walking along. Yes, I am bringing in Eshelman's translation and Auden's classic. Who is this César Vallejo? That's César Vallejo. That's a mugshot just recently discovered. He was born the grandson of two priests and two women of indigenous descent in 1892 in Santiago de Chucho in northern Peru. He enrolls in school, drops out of school due to economic difficulties. This is the refrain of his life. He worked in the Quirivilca mines, which were then acquired by an American company, which proves fundamental in his life and his work. Later, he moves to Lima with the intention of studying medicine. He drops out. Then he finds work as a cashier at a sugar plantation. Then he resigns and he enrolls in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters and then law. And then he abandons it. He read deeply everything he came into, including Cervantes, Quevedo, Whitman, Darío, Kierkegaard. He meets Solia Rosa, whom he called Mirtho, and to whom he dedicated many poems in his first book. And then he had a romantic relationship with Otilia Villanueva, who would inspire a lot of the love poems in Trilce. That relationship ends. His mother dies. During a visit to his hometown in 1919, he is unjustly accused of being an instigator of a violent clash between supporters and opponents of the president. He was persecuted, and after several attempts to remain in hiding, he was arrested. He spent more than 3 months in prison, granted conditional release in 1921. The legal process remains troubling, so he decides to go into exile to Europe. He arrives in Paris, where he lived until his death. He visited Madrid, stays in the USSR. He joins the Communist Party and dies in 1938. A big life. So I want to go to The Black Herald, his first book. This is a posthumous portrait by Pablo Picasso. The Black Herald's Los Heraldos Negros begins with an epigraph from the Gospel of Matthew, which translates to, "He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." And so, to put it another way, those who can understand, let them understand. Parables, as we know, are poetic fictions functioning with the complexity of poetic language, in which a metaphorical narrative illustrates moral or spiritual truths, calling to the listener's imagination to challenge perceptions, to clarify, to make illustrious, to make known through action rather than by direct expression. It would be a mistake to attribute religious references to as an influence without taking into account how much Vallejo's personal choice comes with the effort to find and make his own voice known through a sharp command of religious register, and the path toward that voice becomes sensorial in both senses and spellings of the word. So let those who have ears understand and let them speak. Another way of reading that epigraph we would find in William Carlos Williams' January Morning. This would be a plain spoken translation, although there is no evidence that William Carlos Williams read Vallejo. I believe it is important that in both cases, the assignment is the readers who makes the effort to understand, since poetry demands active interpretation and understanding. This also reminds me of Audre Lorde's questionnaire to oneself, which goes, what words you do not have yet? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? What's the worst that could happen to me if I tell this truth? So answer today and every day. You see, poetry is a continuum that recognizes dignity in ourselves and in others. We become closer to ourselves and to others when we understand them more. But what keeps us back? Why don't we read the Black Heralds as I jump around my lecture for a bit? This is the title poem and a translation by Yvette Seeger, which I'm keen to read. The Black Heralds. Some blows in life, they're so heavy, I don't know. Blows as if dealt by God's own wrath, as if ahead the rip of every single thing we'd ever suffer had pooled inside our souls. I don't know. These are few, but there they are. They carve dark trenches in the toughest faces and the fiercest backs. Perhaps they're the racks of barbarous Attilas, or else the Black Heralds that death had sent us. They're the steep fall of some Christ from the soul of the laudable faith that fate can make foul of. These bloodied blows are the sounds of bread crackling in oven doors, turning to charcoal. As for man, woe, woe is he. He turns his gaze as is answering the call of a slap on the shoulder. His expression is wild, and all that he's lived through is settled like penitent pools in his eyes. Some blows in life, they are so heavy, I don't know. This poem consists of 17 lines, divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stanzas of 4 lines each, and a closing monostitch, repeating the opening line and closing the poem, creating a circular structure. We end how we began, or do we end when we began? On style, the structure of the poem may resemble the Spanish known as cuaderna via, wherein each stanza has exactly 4 lines, typically 14 syllables, split into 2 halves with a caesura somewhere in the middle. So in that way, there is a racket that is shaped in the Spanish of the Alexandrines, and caesuras created by ellipses and semicolons, commas, or exclamation points. You can see here consonant rhyme predominates in the poem and appears in order of each stanza. There's rhyme between the first and the 4th line. There's assonant rhyme between the 2nd and the 3rd. There's rhyme between the 1st and 3rd lines and between the 2nd and 4th line. There's rhyme between the 1st, 2nd, and 4th lines, etc. Then I want to argue that the Alexandrine line becomes a miniature model of how we can experience the world, split as if pleading for coherence, as if to remind us of the insufficiency of language to name, to designate. Vallejo's voice, which is known only or knows only its own uncertainty, requires a language for searching. What one wants to name can barely be expressed and is marked by ellipses. Now, let's look at Sigurd's lines, some blows in lives, they're so heavy, I don't know. What we get here is a left dislocation, as linguists would call it, by which I mean a noun phrase is moved to the beginning of the sentence and replaced by a pronoun within the same clause, as in, my God, you are a good God. And then we get a separate clause, which is barely hanging in there after the ellipses. The sound of it slows down in the dislocation, but it intensifies and so heavy, and then it breaks down in when we don't know. So gone now are Ruben Dario's heralds as muses of history. Gone is Helena, gone is Electra. When God metes out punishment like the God of the Old Testament, when we are in pain and the bond between human and the God plays out, César Vallejo suffers, and he suffers from within. He suffers today, as we all know. And then he writes, and he only suffers in solitude. Note to Sigurd's handling of significant relations among the blows, the carving, the slaps, the bloodied, all in red. The blows which are heavy, they are not hard, they are not endurable. Or the pools in the soul, or the bread that is crackling, it is not just quite crepitant. And the wild eyes that are not demented. The poem sets biblical register of the penitent and the God and God's wrath against something more simple, something more parsable. I would spend hours talking about all the poems I prepared for you, but in the interest of time, let's move to Trilce. We read, of course, that transitional poem that is not part of the collection, but I'd like to spend time with some of the 77 poems that belong to that period of persecution and imprisonment. As a whole, Vallejo tried to erase reference, demanding that language not only say more than it does, but also say everything anew. We know from the physical drafts that Vallejo sought to eliminate the poem's explicit evidences in a process of revision equivalent to trimming away reference. In this way, Trilce may rehearse a kind of thought. It presents evidence, it compares proofs, it tests hypotheses, and it draws conclusions. As I mentioned before, or rather, I skipped. In the interest of time, for Vallejo, the poem is an act of life revealing itself in the very act of a poet speaking. Vallejo chooses to erase connections because other new connections are needed to free the poem from explanation, to leave uncertainty open. Speech and life become a kind of word management in a poem, and what is implied then fractures. What is coded opens up, yielding sharper sense. In Trilce, immediate voices are heard, long dead ones too, as are the intonation and breath of everyday speech. And here lies pulse in its presence, the stammering and babble in Trilce remains in us against the world that is mute. Trilce comes to us with the sound of pain and the stammering of history when it comes into being. And the poems move us even when not everything is clear. Even in the dint and the texture of memory, the poems in Trilce have texture. Let's read number 56. Every day I wake blindly to work so as to live, and I eat breakfast, not tasting a bit of it. Every morning, now knowing if I have achieved or more, never something that explodes with flavor or is merely the heart, and that returned now will lament how far this is the least. A child could grow up loaded with happiness. Oh, dawns before the grief of parents unable to allow us to wrest this world from their dreams of love, understood themselves even as creators and loved us even to doing us harm. Fringes of an invisible weft, teeth that ferret from neuter emotion, pillars free of base and crowned in the great mouth that has lost speech, match after match in the blackness, tear after tear in clouds of dust. There is a curious way in which tedium enters the apartment that is this poem, as though we also have had the uneasy dreams that is the that is a bureaucratic institution transformed, as it is for Gregor Samsa. One may not necessarily ask who has made all the racket as this book begins, but whose unintelligible laws set up the world. What is striking about this poem is how the subjects progressively become general. We begin with an I in Everything I Wake Blindly. You see it at the top. And then that I wakes as if by touch. That would be my translation. Eating breakfast without tasting it. From then we move outward to a child, to the parents, to a collective. We figured like a god. And finally to that strange great mouth that has lost speech. Who invented this I, invited this I out when we are reduced to a mere function, walking, eating, living in the body, now gives way to impersonal figures, and language itself is lost. And that loss of flavor signals erosion when images can only clone themselves, match becoming match, tier becoming tier, by which I mean ellipses. The opening lines are monotonous and flat, deliberately so. The sixth syntax of the poem reads at the start as if this were an annual performance review, moving mechanically from one thing to the next, mirroring the repetitive structure of labor. But then the poem advances, and that clarity fractures. Lines become more disjointed in enjambments, then they assert themselves, and then the poetic image begins interrupting our expectation. And then there's that great mouth. He sees what no one else can see, that they all know, but they don't know. We have seen elsewhere in Vallejo's work. And it is that the essence of labor, our work, is a phenomenon of the human condition. But even more surprisingly, there is a poetic potential contained in that fantastical aspect of the office. The office has room for creation. You can note the apparent stability of the poem's metric. One line's open, and then it contracts unevenly with no consistent stress or rhythmic pattern to govern them. They maintain the surface and appearance of order. Even the most basic acts performed within the lines are, though, incoherent. Is this anti-poesía? Note, too, how poems unfold through parataxis, placing images and phrases side by side without subordinating them in logical order. Note the consonants in the last line, tear after tear in clouds of dust. The poem, in the end, scatters when a curtain falls. This is the limit of Trilce. We find a poetry that has nearly exhausted what it can do. Meter dissolves, syntax breaks apart, and the language seesaws between thoughtful simplicity and opacity. Let's move on then to two poems from prose poems, human poems in Spain. Take this cup away from me. The first. Every day I wake blindly. Oh, that's not it. Mas. The title of this poem is Masa, and as the original and the translation, it is of course a pun between a congregation and also material. Mass, at the end of the battle and the combatant dead, a man came toward him and said, "Don't die. I love you so much." But the corpse, alas, kept on dying. Two approached him and repeated, "Don't leave us. Be brave. Return to life." But the corpse, alas, kept on dying. 220, 100,000, 500,000 came up to, crying out, "So much love and no power against death." But the corpse, alas, kept on dying. Millions of persons surrounded him with a common plea, "Don't leave us, brother." But the corpse, alas, kept on dying. Then all the inhabitants of the earth surrounded him. The corpse looked at them sadly, moved. He sat up slowly, embraced the first man, started to walk. Consider how this is kind of a chant or a litany with refrains. That's a Vallejo signature. That's as good as we've got with Vallejo. Also note how the lines seem to disperse. They become longer too. It is also interesting the overlap of mass as a congregation and as material or as amount of matter. We have moved toward a more material reading of the poem Space. As I mentioned, Vallejo had become a communist. Note how the poem populates itself with enumeration, how it has grown syntactically clear. It's a parable. Could this be prose lineated to mark time and to expand? And just when you feel like you can parse Vallejo's internal politics by association, this man, this singular man, once anointed, gets up, assembles himself, and just walks out. We come to a certain kind of limit that we cannot pass. You shall not pass. The poem ends. And then the second poem, perhaps Vallejo's most popular poem, in two translations, one by Robert Bly, the other one by Clayton Eshelman. We are almost at an hour, so we will end with this. I will read both. Black stone lying on a white stone. I will die in Paris on a rainy day, on some day I can already remember. I will die in Paris and I don't step aside, perhaps on a Thursday, as today is Thursday in autumn. It will be a Thursday because today, Thursday, setting down these lines, I have put my upper arm bones on wrong. And never so much as today have I found myself with all the road ahead of me, alone. César Vallejo is dead. Everyone beat him, although he never does anything to them. They beat him hard with a stick and hard also with a rope. These are the witnesses, the Thursdays, and the bones of my arms, the solitude and the rain and the roads. Black stone on a white stone. I will die in Paris with hard, dirty rain. On a day I now remember, I will die in Paris, and I don't run. Maybe a Thursday, like today in autumn. Thursday, because today, Thursday, when I prose these lines, I have forced my humor eye on unwillingly. And never like today have I again, with all my road, seen myself alone. César Vallejo is dead. They beat him, everyone, without him doing anything to them. They hit him hard with a stick and hard likewise with a rope. Witnesses are the Thursdays and the humorous bones, the loneliness, the rain, and the roads. There's a curious story about the provenance of this poem. And Antenor Orrego tells us that during a walk in Paris and in the grip of depression, Vallejo, dressed in a black coat, sat on a white stone, and it reminded him of a tomb. And that contrast between black and white suggested the core idea of the poem. Shortly before his travels to Europe, Orrego tells us Vallejo woke him in the middle of the night to say that he has just had a dream, seeing himself dead in Paris. So it seems that he already had the memory of his own death available to him. Jeffrey Brock for Poetry magazine, writing for poetry, reminds us of the Roman custom reported by Ovid, where the guilt or innocence of an accused was decided by jurors who, after hearing the evidence, placed a stone, black for guilt, white for innocence, into an urn. And then Brock even suspects a connection to Henri Spies, a German lawyer and one of the leading Swiss poets of his generation, whose poems I Will Die bear some resemblance to Vallejo's poem. I'm less interested in the genesis of the poem than considering it as a monument, made even more so by, for example, Bly's touch. He decides to indent the first line of each stanza. Also, note that this poem or these translations and the original are built mainly on Alexandrines again, divided into 4 stanzas in a tempered and measured progression. It's close to a sonnet, but not quite Also consider that we begin in the particular of an I and in the future, only to switch at the envoy, or what would be an envoy to César Vallejo is dead, and the present perfect, suggesting that the work of the past is now present and forever will be. Also note all the words about the body, shoulders and bones, and then all the words about time and fate, Thursday, today, day, and all the words about violence and suffering, hit, stick, rope, and how they are concatenated. Perhaps this is a kind of secular transubstantiation taking place in the rain. I think this is perhaps the most salient example of how Vallejo may be legible to us, parsable in sentiment, alongside grammatical transgressiveness. And that's how I feel his poems lengthen over our soul. In the shadow, a poem must do something. Dislocation by injury is integral to these poems, and it is descriptive of how they move us somewhere to an elsewhere. Perhaps they score themselves in our poet's imagination, leaving an imprint with real weight, so that we may feel César Vallejo deep within in the evening and when we leave, when the night falls. Thank you. I had 7 additional pages, but I thought I had 2 hours, and I felt like a channel Helen Wendler. But I'm too young. Anywho, I am happy to answer questions. There is a lot of material that we could not cover, but I feel like I want you to go out thinking that Vallejo ultimately can be read by keeping 2 things in mind. There's the linguistic adventurousness. You see that in the language. You also see that in the translations. But then there's also more classical. He was, after all, very interested in the symbolism. He was interested in romanticism of his work. The work that apes romantic style is the one that I find less interesting, but it is his inventiveness. He will always delete something. He will always cut a line at the wrong place. And that sense of incorrectness is what makes his poems really breathe and help us learn how to write different poems outside of the confessional and post-confessional modes we've all grown comfortable with here in the United States of. Any questions? Subin, yes. There's a mic going around.
In the last poem, did you have a version that you personally prefer?
It is difficult to answer that question because I admire the totality of Eshelman's project, his advocacy. These translations have anthropological and poetic value to me. But Bly's translation, and it's interesting that I called it a poem. It is, after all. But it was the first translation of that poem I read. And so it's the one that's close to me. I can look at it critically and point to moments where the translation itself is doing more than the original, if that could be assessed. But I think those gestures are interesting and generative. So I would go out for a drink with Bly over Eshelman, because there's something monumental about the way that he builds that poem, perhaps delivered in kind of like idiomatic. There's something idiomatic about his translation that brings a little more depth to Vallejo's project.
What do you think about, sorry, this is the indentation? Is that, because that's not in the original poem?
The original poem.
So then what do you make of that? Is that allowed for as a translator?
Sure. Sure. I mean, so I go by the most recent edition of Vallejo's poems, and that has been cross-referenced with the first edition, the revised edition. That indentation doesn't exist. But I know that some poems generally, when printed, include that indentation as a signal. This is a new stanza. I think a more generative way of talking about this would be to say something like, okay, let's say this is intentional, right? Which we believe it is, looking at flies. What does it do to the poem? And for me as a poet, what would it mean for me to start a stanza with an indentation? So I can't tell because I don't have the original Vallejo, but if you have millions of dollars, please purchase one for me. And I can answer this, but I can't, right? I can't find it. I don't know, but I can at least think generatively about what I see.
Okay, we should try to get our hands on that.
Yeah. I believe over there was a question.
Thank you for the introduction. You just said, so there's no original,
There is.
but it's the $1 million one.
Excuse me?
So I didn't understand the joke that you just made. If there's $1 million.
Oh, I'm just saying if I have to pay $1 million for an original copy, I would fundraise for that.
Ah,
There are copies of the original, yes.
and it is that.
Oh no, I don't
of
know.
value?
I don't know, but to me, yes, it's worth each and every penny of that.
Wow, interesting. I mean, the way you introduce this poet made me very curious about it, and I want to read about him. Earlier, you mentioned about he intentionally dropped a line, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that your interpretation of his dropping the lines, or he actually said in the process, like his creative process?
There are copies of his manuscripts, and he will drop lines. He will bring words together in the process of revision. So everything was fair game for him. And so for many scholars, the question is which of these versions is the one closest to the experience of the poem.
So the final version wasn't from him per se.
Well, scholars can make a determination just by looking at all the versions and perhaps what is the latest one. In some cases, they will identify a version of the manuscript as, say, this is the Black Herald's draft 3, 1917, for example.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Then the last question. Hope it's okay. You don't have to answer it. I don't know you well enough, but from the beginning of the program, through your reading and your explanation and all these, I noticed like your energy actually changed.
Yes.
I'm curious, is that you're just tired, or
No.
is being the poet, you reading the poems, that's your emotion going through?
That's a great question. So,
Thank you.
My original intention was to read the lecture, but then I realized the lecture is 20 pages long, because I love Vallejo, and so Vallejo takes over me when I read him out loud and when I read him at home, and so I do not know how to modulate that voice when I'm performing, because yes, he can be challenging. As a poet, you look at the lines and they can be challenging. So a part of me feels compelled to take my time and to try to bold the line or italicize the line with my reading, if that makes any sense. I'm not tired. I could go on for 8 hours. But sadly, we just have an hour.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, he brings something out of each and every reader, and because he's so devout. At one point, American poet James Wright calls him dangerously devout, and I feel like there's something really marvelous about that descriptor because it charges religion with some kind of advocacy, social advocacy. And I feel like some kind of readers will see that, other kinds of readers will not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a
Patricia,
couple of-
and then you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. You were going to keep on talking, Madame. I got a couple of questions. One is, are there any recordings
No,
of him? None whatsoever.
no.
Are there any recordings of any of his peers reading him?
I don't believe so.
That would be really interesting to find out, wouldn't
Yeah.
it? The other thing I was going to ask is, when you were doing Mass, Christian that I am in some ways, it just struck me as this was all about resurrection.
Yeah, that too.
And but that instead of it being about the divine raising up the dead, it is the people doing it, which goes back to that social advocacy part of what you're talking about. And I thought that was fascinating. And the other thing is that that marker of 1922 that almost calls for some kind of bizarro anthology.
Yeah.
That would pull all of these different people together, because it's really an amazing. I mean, it's sort of like, I was at a thing once, a panel that Talani Davis was on, and she listed all of the Black authors who were published in 1956. And it was like every one of the major ones that you could think of, Baldwin, right, all of them, right? And so there's this sense of a confluence of ideas that are going through. Do you have any sense of who he also was reading himself when he was making his work?
So when he was, who he was reading?
Yeah.
I can't answer that without going into the record and looking at my notes, but just by looking at the work, obviously you can tell that he has been reading what's going on in Latin America and what's going on in Spain. Let's not forget that his last book, posthumous book, would have been about the Spanish Civil War, and it's a very moving, rousing poem that at times, serial poem that reminds me at times of some of Garcia Lorca's like rigor and vigor. So you can tell that he's been reading these figures, and he's been reading in French, he's been reading in Spanish. There's also a poem to Whitman where Whitman makes a cameo. He also writes about Darwin quite a lot. Chaplin as well. So he was someone who was very much in touch with cultural production at the time of his life. As to 1922, let's not forget that it not only marks, right, the return of all these soldiers, right, from the end of the First World War, but then followed by a devastating pandemic. So I feel like the world was due some kind of effervescence. And I think Woolf is very good at getting to that in her psychopathy. She will kill someone in every book she writes, and I feel like she's probably reacting to the real surprise of all these deaths happening so immediately. But yeah, what's striking about 1922 though is that Vallejo is usually kept outside of those conversations because, again, he's seen as a difficult poet. He is, but so is life. So are the Psalms, right? So is religious scripture. It is demanding of us. But he was also someone who was indigenous and brought in the indigenous world and cadences and imagery into the colonial context. And that, the baggage at times is not. It doesn't make the trip. Yes.
Two questions. First, very practical question. Sure. Practical question. Where are his archives? Who has his papers?
Peru, at the library in Peru.
Okay. And the second, about him as a poet and his process. Was he the guy that woke up at 5 every morning and worked for 3 hours, or was he the guy that had long periods when the muse struck?
I don't know, but I do know that he was constantly revising. There are many versions of the same poem with crossouts, etc. So
Probably daily.
I would assume so.
Okay.
Yeah. Wendy, yes.
I would love to hear you read some of the poems in Spanish, and I wanted to ask if anyone has translated them. I was going to say with the rhyme, but of course, I mean recreating the rhyme. I would just like to hear the sound.
So Vallejo's work is not sing-songy, by which I mean there's not a lot of emphasis given to end rhymes. It's mostly slant rhymes.
I saw some in one, at least.
Yeah, so the rhymes it's mostly consonants. So it's mostly replication of consonant sounds. So it's more mitigated. But he's definitely not sing-songy. He is the kind of poet I would translate through, if I ever get to translate him, through concepts. So, for example, this is just a silly example, but if I were to start a line end the line with the color red, then when the next line is supposed to rhyme, I would say something like apple, and then something like New York. If that's the kind of rhyming I want to do, so it's more conceptual. But it's because I don't have a handle on rhyme in Spanish. Even though I speak it, I just can't write it, and so I don't know how to translate it.
When you, this is the end, but when you say not sing-songy, do you mean not musical?
He is musical, but it's a different kind of music, right? So it's musical in the way that psalms could be music, sometimes rhyme or not rhyme, depending on the translation, right? Or scripture, more generally. I can read, let me read Piedra Negra sobre una piedra blanca, the last poem, so that you hear it in Spanish. Piedra negra sobre una piedra blanca. Me moriré en país. Piedra negra sobre una piedra blanca. Just can't see. There we go. Me moriré en París con aguacero, un día del cual tengo ya el recuerdo. Me moriré en París y no me corro. Tal vez un jueves, como es hoy de otoño. Jueves será, porque hoy jueves que proso estos versos, los húmeros, me he puesto a la mala. Y jamás como hoy me he vuelto con todo mi camino a verme solo. César Vallejo ha muerto, le pegaban todos sin que él les haga nada. Le daban duro con un palo y duro también con una soga. Son testigos los días jueves y los huesos húmedos, la soledad, la lluvia, los caminos. So there is a lot of consonant sound moving the poem forward. The closest you have to some kind of metrical regularity would be the first stanza, but that's something that he keeps pushing against purposefully. He is someone who will probably play with the trappings of romantic, perhaps modernist poetry, aka Darío, but he will go in and fuck it up because he feels like that's important. Yes, Star.
This is a sort of silly question, but when you read Vallejo, do you only read it in Spanish?
Oh, in all the languages I can and I know. So English and Spanish.
So you do read it in English as well?
Yes.
And do you read it and see, oh, I wouldn't do that, I would change it?
Yes.
So that you make judgments as you're reading in English, and you'd say, I would see this a different way. I mean, translation is such a strange way that we read other languages anyway, because it's already gone through a translator.
Yeah.
And you're reading this in the original, in the Spanish. So why bother with the English at all?
Because I, as someone who writes in Spanish and in English, I want to steal. I want to know how how a line could be written, a line I don't know could be written.
But as I understand you, you write in Spanish.
I write in Spanish, yeah,
and
but
then you translate into
most
English.
times, yeah.
So then when we read your poems, they have already gone through translation.
In most cases, but not in all. The last one you read, I think it came in English first, but I can't remember.
Yeah, interesting.
It's not to be dismissive. I feel like we can write of my own process, but I feel like the invitation that translation brings us is learning from other cultures how the thing is done, how the sausage could be made.
But you wouldn't, for example, need this book.
I have it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I read it too. Yeah.
Because I'll look at the Spanish, but I don't speak it.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's beautiful across the page. I don't like to own a poetry book that was written in another language
Yeah.
if I can't see that language as well,
Yeah.
whatever the language
There's
is.
there's the richness of having the original as some kind of anthropological necessity, right? If you don't read the other language, I don't know, I get it in all the ways it can come to me. And so if it comes in Spanish and in English, great. French, I don't know. Italian, some. So I can still learn. There's also more dramatic and radical forms of translation, like the Sukovskis did, which is translating by sound, right? Like you can do that by engaging with the text in another language, and having it is important.
Thank you.
Yeah, Patricia.
Interesting conversation. I was just thinking that one of the things that's really interesting about being able to read in different or try to understand poets from another language is that what you're also trying to do is be in conversation. I mean, it's fascinating to me that so many South American poets, for instance, are in conversation with Whitman.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he knew about any of these people, because it was all after he was dead. But I mean, I think that you don't know who's going to influence you.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think everybody in this room who's a poet has read Lorca at some point, and we are all influenced by Lorca, even if we don't know what that influence is. Mm-hmm. You can feel it sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's necessary to be fluent, I guess, in another language, other than to be curious as you possibly can, and try to see how open you can be to what that poet is saying. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it don't.
Yeah, and going back to the image of the mouth, getting the book without the original feels like you're getting the bottom part or the top part, but not both, right? Yes, Rai.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Whoa. I'm very curious, when you first read a Vallejo poem, what was going through your head, honestly, and do you read a bunch of them at once, or is it kind of like one and done sort of deal when you are
one
reading
and done?
them? Yeah,
most likely.
Yeah,
but for the sake of this class and these 10 pages.
Yeah, that makes sense.
20 pages, I read all of it.
Yeah.
In a month. But
wow.
The first Vallejo poem I encountered was Mass. I was in a translation class with Michael Scamell at Columbia, and I needed to find something to translate. And I have this anthology I've been carrying around since high school, and Mass is there. And, you know, when you start translating, there are many ways to go about it. You can crib it, by which I mean you render the poem word by word, so you have a word by word gloss of how the language appears on the page, and then you go in and then you change it according to tone, mood, whatever it is. And then it just takes a while for you to understand that translation is not word by word, right? And Masa was that poem that taught me that. And it was the simple part. I don't have it here in Spanish. I do. Let me see if I have it. Oh, I don't. So Vallejo uses A-Y as an interjection. The translators say alas, right? which carries its own sort of like historical connotation or historical register. And I remember thinking, how would I translate the prick of I on the line? So I tried alas. I won a prize, so that's how I made that decision, right? But I now think that the best way to go about it is to reinsert the I, right? So it was Masa. It was Mas, that first poem, that taught me that it's not word by word. You are doing something more tenebrous.
Thanks.
Can I just ask one last question?
Yes, if you let me read the whole thing.
Of course.
No, go ahead.
I'd like to know, where do you see César Vallejo's poetry existing beyond the page?
Beyond the page. So there is a movie that was filmed, I want to say the Ukraine, but I may be wrong, that is based on Los Heraldos Negros, or it takes language from the Black Heralds. It came out in the early aughts, I believe. So also, I don't know, I hope that 1,000 years from now we will have Los Heraldos Negros or Trilce as our Bible, right? Or as an appendix, right? The gospel according to César. I'm serious. I feel like his brand style of religious questioning is deeply humane and immediate to me. And I see myself in that, right? Because it is borrowed speech, borrowed language, but it's also more than just that. But I think he's deeply unfilmable. So I don't know how these people did it. I need to watch the movie again, but he's still very present in Latin American arts and culture. So I'm happy where he is. I just want more people reading him.
Well, thank you so much, Ricky. Can we please give Ricardo Alberto Maldonado a big round of applause? This was fantastic, Ricky. Thank you.